Good evening from India. This is Vivadhan from IGP, and we are live for another episode of Global Hint. After a long time, I have been live. So, again, thank you so much for all. We will be discussing about two interesting things. First is about what we call the Jaishankar Doctrine, as was proclaimed in the Atlantic Council in a particular event where External Affairs Minister Dr. Jaishankar was actually delivering a statement on the Goldilocks principle in 2019. And we are also going to discuss about the US India 2 plus 2, in which a lot of great developments amidst the so called noise of certain statements of the leaders from both India and US have come in. So, to begin this discussion, we have three panelists. We have Akshok from ORF, we have Krishnan, defense analyst and specialist, and we have Rishabh from NMIS. So, uh, to start this discussion right away, the context has been that this week for the Indo Pacific and Indo US relations has been quite interesting. People say it was tumultuous. Some people say, oh, you know what, it was not good. Some people say it was just excellent. The Quad will flourish. While we have also seen some developments regarding AUKUS, where the AUKUS members have been calling on Japan to join the Security Pact. So uh, let's start the discussion by the question which I'm going to ask, which I would like to ask to Akshay. Uh, so we see that there's a lot of noise, right? And amidst the noise which came in because Secretary of State Blinken from the United States and our External Affairs Minister from India made certain statements about human rights issues, and we know how that goes along, right? How do you see the trajectory of the US-India relationship in that case? And maybe also maybe Krishnan can give a follow up when I ask him this question. And I would like to add this question for you. In terms of defense relationship between of us and the US, how has the relationship become better, and how will these two talks go ahead? Because we also know that I think the 2+2 talks have continued after 1.5 years because of a delay due to COVID and all, as we know, right? So how do you see it? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me this morning, evening your time. Let me start with the second question first. I think there's been nuance added, right? And a lot of the research I've done in the last few weeks points to one thing, right? Like there's a lot of these statements that go about in trying to find the method and the madness of India's abstention. And one of the more easier notes to say is that, oh, it's because India has a legacy and a partnership with Russia. Um, yes, but that's not true. That's only looking at a simple superficial tagline. You have to understand it. It's in the 75 years of India's independent history. For the first 50 years, there was no US, right? There was no defense back to the US. You have to go into it a little further to understand why, for fundamentally, India was not a security ally. India was not a treaty ally. The United States and Washington and Islamabad did have a security pact, which is why their military prowess is more F-16s and India's is more MiGs and Sukhois, just superficially. Um, you have to look at the fact that after Smiling Buddha of 74 and then Pokhran test of 98, there were sanctions imposed, and India was not part of CTBT or NPT, did not come on to any of those. So from those Clinton era sanctions to a little over under a decade later, you had the nuclear deal, and it's only in 2001 the Bush administration waved back all the nuclear sanctions. Had the NSSP of 2004, the nuclear deal announced in '05. Ratified in 2006 and signed in 2007, really fructified by India. That was a seminal point where India and the United States became strategic partners, more than just diplomatic bonhomie. There were always diplomatic relations that hit another little bit during Nixon and Indira, a little bit during the Robin Rafael term of the first Clinton administration in the 90s. But that's when India and the US really became close. So it's not like there was this over reliance on Russia. Just for 50 years, as Secretary Blinken also said, there was no United States. And we can go back into history, but we don't want to too much. But from Dulles Eisenhower to Nixon Kissinger to realize where the low points on any bonhomie was. And of course, India was also strategically autonomy, and that was a language that in the Western world, particularly the Washington, never understood at a time of a Cold War, great bloc power competition where it was either one block or the other, so no one really knew where they stood. So let's put that into context, right? So I think that was the second question first, and I think since then you've kind of seen, if you do like for like comparisons, we've seen say more Blackhawks being bought in place of Russian Kamovs. You've seen more M16 Sigur rifles coming in place of Kalashnikovs, right? I mean, so like for like comparison, the defense partnership with the United States is going up. India and the US since 2018 have had this the fourth 2+2, the first with the Biden administration. India and Russia have also started it, but that's because India maintains its partnerships. It doesn't eradicate them completely, but but the partnership with the United States has gone so much further. And just to answer your first question for now, and just very briefly, is fundamentally, look, there will always be hiccups in every relationship because two democracies have their own way of operating. India is not a treaty ally or a strategic ally. There'll be lockstep on major issues such as the Indo-Pacific and the larger framework. There'll be difference in approaches. Both India and the United States have condemned the violence in Ukraine and called for cessation of violence. But of course, the United States is a driving force in the Western-led sanctions, and uh, Moscow the forever adversary in some ways, whereas for New Delhi, that's not so much so. And lastly, that's because I think the administration understood it. The comments will come from the hill, but like I said, the administration will understand it. The press will have their own comments as well. So these are mere distractions, whereas the long term perspective is fine. It's like there's symptoms of something, but the symptoms is anesthesia, but the long term thing is anesthesia required to cure something much major. So that's where I'll leave it at.
Okay. So, Krishnan, I have a question for you, and you can take up the question which I had asked Akshob. So, let's talk about defense more before we talk about the Jaishankar Doctrine and the Goldilocks Principle. So, what do you get out of the defense talks which have happened? And I remember you had elaborated about the way Secretary Blinken understands the Indian counterparts. So, how do you see the role of the Biden administration right now as far as the talks have happened in the realm of defense? Because you understand that, and I'm sure you'd be happy to elaborate.
Thanks, Abhi. So I think the way I look at it is the Biden administration has kind of outsourced its India relationship to the State Department, is how I see it largely. This is not a relationship that is driven from the Department of Defense. I mean, like, not out of Pentagon. If you look at many of the US relationships, the Pentagon would play a more uh, major role in the way, because part of the reason is the US is used to its alliance framework where the military plays a significant part in its relationship with them. But but the relationship with India is quite different, right? Like, we do not have a Article 5 NATO kind of relationship with the US. So the Pentagon takes a backseat, and usually the State Department kind of leads from the front. And specifically in the Biden administration, it has been much more true that this this is a relationship that is being led from the State Department rather than even from the White House. That's how I see it. The White House seems to be much more concerned about its own domestic issues, about projecting the power of Biden and Harris, both domestically and abroad, and kind of more embroiled in Europe. I mean, it's getting distracted. So that's the way I would put it in terms of the overall relationship under the Biden administration. So as long as, well, I think I'm just repeating what I said yesterday on Twitter. As long as uh, Anthony Blinken has a significant clout within the White House and be able to kind of talk down others within the Biden administration, I think we are pretty safe. And sanctions is definitely not on the table as far as I could see. Uh, with regards to the defense relationship, specifically, I think Secretary Austin mentioned about the space situation awareness agreement. I think that is kind of a framework. It's going to form as the stepping stone for something which is much larger. These space situation awareness is not a simple a simple agreement that the US does with everything, because it is not just about information sharing. I think there is a lot of capability sharing that's going to happen, and it is also going to form the basis, just like how Lemova or Becca or Comcasa is. I think we should be looking at this space cooperation at the same level as what we are seeing with regards to Lemova and Becca. What was your other question again? Sorry.
Yes. So I had asked Akshob about the defense relationship, and I think you have already elaborated on that. So I think yeah. If you wish to add
Yeah,
something,
sure.
you can do it quickly. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think from the way I look at it, Secretary Austin, as a Secretary of Defense, he seems to be a much more kind of a bureaucrat rather than as a leader. He seems to be someone who just wants to keep the office running as is, rather than take any special initiatives, bring his own kind of character into the Pentagon. That's what I'm able to see. I mean, this is not just with regards to India, but as a whole across the world. I haven't seen any special initiatives coming from him with regards to kind of like uh, the way I saw out of Jim Mattis or any of his predecessors. Even Chuck Hagel, I would say, was more proactive as a Secretary of Defense. So I think all Secretary Austin wanted out of this in India US relationship, defense relationship, was to like do not disturb the apple cart, right? Just when it is progressing, keep it steady, let it progress. That's the kind of message that I saw from him. So largely it was about like consolidating all the previous gains that India and US had made. And one of the major things that the unmanned aerial vehicles, the air launched unmanned aerial vehicles, that was also signed during Secretary Austin's tenure. So it seems like he does want to put some degree of substance and not just do talk and talk and just do sales. So in that sense it is good, and he also spoke about the increasing complexity of exercises and the new kind of exercises in cyber and space domain. So those are something really new, and that's going to be like extraordinarily useful for India in terms of learning. We may not be able to learn completely from the US, because these happen at a very polished and a very basic level, but we would be able to understand the mindset of the Americans, and it's up to us to kind of take it forward internally within our own government setup as to how we tackle. So as far as I see, we are in third gear, and we are just moving ahead with either in third gear or fourth gear.
Yeah, as far as technology partnership is concerned, in hard power contexts, as far as you have explained, I think it depends on how would India maneuver further. Okay, so let me get to Rishabh now. So I know that I am asking about shared values, but I'm only asking about from a pragmatic aspect because I remember that we have been discussing about this on Twitter, on threads, and so forth. And I like the threads by both Rishabh and Krishnan, very interesting. And I decided that, you know what, ek ke bad ek se bade do. So I'm discussing the essence of the threads. So Rishabh, my question to you is, although we know that, you know, the leaders and their statements are usually sometimes overhyped or and even magnified, in the case of what happened with Blinken and Jaishankar, um, as far as the big term is concerned, which is shared values, do you think that such statements made by them made any sense, as far as what statements were made by Dr. Jaishankar in Harvard University, where he talked about India as a civilization state and, you know, other things of accountability and so forth, and also by Secretary Blinken? I think that, as Krishnan stated, Secretary Blinken has been very cooperative with the Indian counterparts in fostering the Indo-US relationship, and it's a very State Department-led thing rather than a more President Biden-led thing, in my view. But anyways, yeah, you go on.
Yeah, no, thank you first of all for inviting me. It's good to join Akshob and Krishan. I see. I think my views on this are actually not in. I mean, I don't think there are some people think that this is something. This is a view which kind of puts me at odds with whatever Krishnan and Akshob said before, but I don't think that necessarily true. uh, I totally agree. For example, that these kind of, especially the two plus two summit, etc. You see leaders coming together, kind of steadying the boat, so to speak. I mean, if you look at the joint statement, you see, for example, they emphasize on the fact that that yes, global order is still based on certain principles, etc. And they condemn the civilian killings, etc. So basically, emphasizing on the convergence bit. And if you look at, for example, the Indo-Pacific white sheet that came a few weeks ago, or for example, what has been said, what Krishnan pointed out in his own what he wrote yesterday on Twitter, uh, that there is been, for example, a good amount of, at least in terms of rhetoric, uh, commitment in terms of co-development, etc. Something that we've seen United States being a little hesitant about when it comes to defense and security. In fact, which is of course one of the reasons why, in many of these instances, our relationship with defense relationship with America has not been as strong as we would like, or developed as quickly as we would like. So, having said all that, I mean, it's true that uh, ultimately these things, or these small issues, or divergences will not torpedo the relationship, or be fatal to any relationship. This is a kind of like a back and forth, which Akshop said, that will happen when in between two democracies. And people have also pointed out about you know this is just playing to the galleries, domestic audiences, etc., etc. But my point is not that these things supposedly are going to be fatal to the relationship. My point is that it is not good that we dismiss them so easily by just saying every time that all these things will happen, but we are moving ahead, third gear, fourth gear, whatever. Right? My point is that it is, from an Indian perspective, an important thing to study in a more nuanced fashion as to when it is coming and how it is coming, right? And in what context it is being used at. So if you look at, for example, the statement which Anthony Blinken said, again, some people said that this is just nothing. I would disagree. And again, you can actually have this opinion that yes, it was not a small deal, so to speak, or not a distraction, so to say, but it was something that Indian government or Indian officials did actually keep a track of, and did respond to, by the way, later on, when he had Mr. Jaishankar had his own press conference. So I think, first of all, I think a lot of people missed out on this particular detail, that Blinken, or Anthony Blinken, again, he's very pro India, whatever, and he has very good, or he has a lot of weight in the State Department, etc. Whatever, that I understand, all that. That's fine. I'm not questioning that. The point is that, despite the state, the Biden administration knowing that this is going to be this particular event is going to be under the scanner, right? The fact that it's going to be very magnified, as you said, right, is precisely the reason why some in India would look at it and say, why did he, for example, mention something like, we are monitoring not just human rights abusers, but also specifically government officials, and prison officials and police personnel, etc. And remember, this was not in response to a question that was asked by a journalist, which is normally the case, right? The journalists ask the questions and they say something, and that becomes the headlines, right? uh, this was something that he said it in his prepared statement. And again, if you remember closely, like the last time, the first time when Blinken visited after the Biden administration took power, he came to India, and the message was very subtle. There was this growing idea that United States would not publicly at least come out with some strong statements, etc. All these discussions will have on a very mutual basis in private settings. Now, that of course was something that they did not choose to do this time around. So it is important to, nonetheless, even though you think that it's not important, or we are focusing too much on all these things, it is nonetheless important to actually analyze from an Indian point of view about how they chose to do it and when they chose to do it, right? Publicly, at least. So I mean, if people are saying, for example, that why, or if we are focusing too much on all these things, these are just noise, etc. I mean, that's exactly the point. That is why you do not make it such for example, that the media is going to look at all these things and amplify these things. This is how media always does. They are not going to talk about what Austin says about space cooperation, etc., etc. Because, especially, I mean, remember, these kind of summits, especially after such a tense kind of a situation, or tense kind of a period in the relationship, this was all about optics, because there were very little tangibles to be delivered, right? This was about staying on message, etc. And because it was that kind of a meeting where you were coming out with certain commitments, you were kind of showing it to the world that here we are, there's a reason why we are here, etc. The fact that you brought these things in such a different manner, that of course will raise eyebrows. And there is no reason for you to dismiss it, right? You can acknowledge that there has been a progress in the relationship, or there is a kind of a recommitment, so to speak, or reaffirming of the relationship, while also acknowledging that these things exist. And something which, again, people have to realize is important from an Indian perspective. uh, yes, it does not matter in the larger scheme of things, but again, see, you have to remember that, you have to see that the mainstream media is always going to focus like this on these things. Yes, the elders are in charge, etc., etc. But from an Indian perspective, it's also very important that these issues do get highlighted or are not entirely cornered, because you see, for example, that how the public reacted had an impact on how the entire Indian political class also perceived the issue, right? I mean, the fact that there was a bipartisan consensus on this, right, also kind of sends message to not just the US but other countries about what are India's intention, and how India, or the Indian government in general, is going to have a view about all these things, right? So it is important because, in terms of it demonstrates to other countries that, rather than, these kind of things embarrassing the government, these kind of things may backfire. So it may not be the right way to approach, to persuade an Indian government, or any government, or any official, right? So basically, it's a good in terms of it's something which is good in terms of signaling, etc., right? uh, it says that you basically don't cross a certain line, things may go, back and forth. So it was a good thing in that sense, I would say. And also, just to, I think, end here. See, public opinion and domestic signaling, people are right. Like, some of this rhetoric, whether it is done from the Indian side or whether it's done from the American side, they are, of course, happen. They happen, of course, not at the cost of the relationship, but again, you have to remember that they do matter in some way or the other. We should not discount them, of course. We should neither overhype them, because you do get to learn a lot about their system. I mean, the fact that we are looking at Blinken, his role in the State Department, etc., and what drives the relationship. We understand their compulsions, their domestic compulsions, the degree of their compulsions, their limitation, their view and approach of the world, right? So a lot of things can be gauged in terms of, by studying it. Again, hyping it is different. By studying it and highlighting it is very different, right? And again, you have to remember that it's also very important, because a lot of people, like, for example, Ashley Tellis as well. I mean, this is not just me saying it. He says that there is a difference when it comes to, the response, when it comes to India's response. There are mixed feelings in the US government, right? In the executive branch, there is a more nuanced and intelligent understanding of India's constraints and India's position. But then again, on the Hill, there is a sense of disappointment. He actually says that there is this emotive sense of, feeling let down, and that can have small impact on how much, effort will it take from India's side to get certain things done, or to let certain issues be, so to speak, right, on the legislative, or at least on the Capitol Hill, right? And again, here, your question about shared values, etc., is important because I think, I mean, if you read Shiv Shankar's former Foreign Secretary Shiv Shankar Menon's article, he actually says that, ultimately this relationship is surviving, and it's going to survive, and it's going to basically go forward. It because of the fact that we've realized that, there is something which goes beyond these rhetoric about shared values, etc. Those are important, right? But again, you have to understand, how do we sell these things at home? How do we sell this relationship at home? I mean, in India, right, if you ask people, why are we getting close to the United States, right? How has the government of successive governments sold this relationship? The immediate answer will be China, or anti-China kind of a thing, right? To balance China, so to speak. Now, again, a lot of these reactions, whether it is in different forms, different legislative branches, or branches of government, or in the media, etc., kind of tells you also from an Indian perspective as to, how they see it, how they sell it at home, right? So that is why there is, I think, been some sort of a disconnect when it comes to, because they have understood that India may not always back the US position, or be, 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 be on the same position, so to speak, when it comes to
Yeah,
values, so to speak, right? So that
yeah,
those are the things that which are there, which we can at least not
we
dismiss it
can.
entirely. We should focus on,
Yeah,
but at
yeah.
least what is happening and where they're coming from, right? So that's
Yeah,
it.
yeah, 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 definitely, definitely. Okay, so let's move forward. And before we just go ahead, just one very interesting infographic. I got it. So I just would like to share for a minute and then we'll go ahead without any delay. So, this infographic, when the viewers can see it, can explain a lot about how the publics in various countries are perceiving the Ukraine-Russia war or conflict as we know it. So I just wish to show it, and I'm done with it. So, I'll move with the second round of questions and discuss about certain aspects of the relationship in a quick form. So, I'll start with Rishabh, and Rishabh, I'd expect that if you can be a little brief in this.
Hmm.
Uh, uh, I think, okay, so I'll take this question in the end because I think it's about the principle itself. So, Akshay, I'll come back to you now. So, we are seeing that the developments in Ukraine, as far as the conflict is concerned, uh, there are certain middle powers, right? The countries who have joined the Abraham Accords and also the Indo-Abraham Accord as we know it, and even India. These are like emerging middle powers. They are gaining their own stakes. They are having their own partnership with other countries. The Saudis have also announced certain partnerships with the Chinese recently, which has gotten controversial. Some minor disagreements are, of course, are there from from the side of the Saudis, and even we are seeing that relationships have transformed. So some people argue, and I've read this article recently, that the Quad could benefit from the Indo-Russian ties from a transactional POV point of view. Do you really think so? And if yes and no, or howsoever, how do you see it?
Yeah, I read that article as well, and I don't fully agree with that fundamentally because you have to understand this in a couple of contexts. One is as a pre 2020, pre Galwan Valley view, whereas Indian foreign policy always saw themselves as them being the placating force. That is, India and BRICS prevents it from looking anti US, and India in Quad prevents it looking anti China. Of course, China has sort of changed the overturn window on that, and kind of post Galwan Valley clashes, it looks a little more. The Quad, while obviously far from any sort of security pact or security led forces, still has a very elephant in the room being the dragon, right? There's a lot of ways of naming China without naming China, such as free and open Indo-Pacific or rules-based international order, freedom from coercion, for democracies. These are all very China-specific focus. It helps India in some ways to have its, keep its door open. I don't think it helps Quad as such. Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a very tenuous link by saying, well, if it helps India, it helps a Quad because that means India's economy is more robust. Ergo, the Quad is more robust. Yes, but no. Fundamentally, because while yeah, like as while India itself is a very energy import driven market, 84% of India's commodities India imports for 84% of the energy, but of course less than 1 to 2% from Russia, as the foreign minister as well as statistics reveal. What India is concerned about, of course, as oil prices go up, is the balance of payments crisis. This is sort of hesitations of economic history as well. You remember 1991, what people remember about the liberalization, privatization, and globalization models of the economic reforms was there was a balance of payments crisis that pushed India to do it, right? There was a push factor as well. And that's because the Gulf War happened in 1991, and even till today, India gets most of its oil from Iraq, followed by Saudi Arabia and UAE, and then the United States over Russia. So, and also in 2013, when oil prices shot up as well, the rupee crashed against the dollar severely because the current account deficit just ballooned. So there is that concern. And of course, Jen Psaki and the White House and of course the administration have made it clear that it does not behoove India to increase their economic imports. But of course, even if India does increase any of the energy imports, it's mostly for energy security and not to counter Western sanctions. So I don't think that it helps because fundamentally, even as geographically already revealed, Japan and Australia are very much US security allies and have been more vehement and excoriating Moscow for its unchecked aggression. So I would say that article misses the forest for the trees on a lot of aspects. Where I would say that if at all it would help the Quad a little more, is the fact that and we're going to see the Quad's second summit on May 24th, for principals meeting, the second summit as well, is narrowly defining more focus, because the Quad's focus is still firmly Indo-Pacific, right? And we know the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov is not the Indo-Pacific. So while of course you can't ignore the elephant in the room, which is the crisis in Ukraine, but of course, if the focus of the Quad is more, while globalist in nature, it's also more region specific. So I think that would help the Quad more. So I see, yes, India's energy security and its and a robust, economically empowered India will help the Quad, but I don't see that fundamentally, because and I think where it would help the Quad more is what the administration has done right now. And don't forget, India and Japan are going to have the 2+2 model as well. Scott Morrison and Prime Minister Modi had a virtual summit before the Quad as well, and depends on the Australian elections, there'll be another engagement. So I think as long as there's breathing room for individual partners to do as they conduct the external affairs, I think that's where it'll help the Quad. So that's sort of the long and short answer of it.
Great. I'll just then move on to Krishnan. So, Christian, you can, if you have some additional views on what Akshay and Rishabh have said, you can add that up, of course, in this response. But I have a question on AUKUS. So, Japan has been asked by the members of the AUKUS to join their security pact. And there is a sense of logic that, you know what, there's a Taiwan issue which will come in up, there's a South China Sea issue, and the whole Pacific region, the Far East. Of course, the role of Japan as a US ally, maybe it could therefore make sense for the Japanese to join AUKUS. While some argue that maybe for them, the Quad might lose its relevance, right? Although, of course, we know that the Quad is not necessarily a hard power block, it has a lot of other things to do, which is already going on. And yeah, some of them have their own pitfalls too. So, how do you see this development? Do you think that the Quad has its relevance or losing its relevance or not? How do you see it? Yeah.
Yeah. So I'd like to split the whole context into two parts. So there is a zero sum aspect to it, and then there is a positive sum aspect to it. So focusing on the positive sum aspect first, I believe the emergence of a new security pact in the Indo-Pacific region that almost specifically focus on China as the primary adversary kind of helps India, because it, at least at the bare bones, it reaffirms that both Australia, the UK, and the US are pretty much clear that China is going to be their primary adversary, right? So at least we've got that cleared. And I think the talk of G2, which I myself made probably a couple of weeks back, might be subdued by the fact that they are now looking at a security pact with Australia, right? So and I'm taking it in the under the assumption that Japan may still not join the AUKUS. Um, this is about the positive aspect of it. So because it comes from a very deep level of trust, and as some would definitely call it, it's a civilizational thing. It's an Anglo-Saxon thing. The UK, US, and Australia, uh, they do see they do have a sense of shared destiny as to where they all want to be. And India being not part of that vision is kind of, I think, given. Those of us who were thinking that the US does see India as a part of destiny from a peer perspective are probably still delusional. And those who are looking for such a kind of cooperation, I think that's never going to happen. So in that sense, I think AUKUS kind of reaffirms the fact that there is going to be a security grouping that is going to focus on China in the Western Pacific and kind of the Southern Indian Ocean, the ASEAN side of things. But there's also a zero sum aspect to it, and we definitely can't deny that. Let us say, like, if China is the primary, I mean, it's not if, China is the primary concern for many of the issues that's going on in the Indo-Pacific, whether it is South China Sea or whether it is all the debt traps around going around in the Indo-Pacific region, or whether it is related to the kind of militarization that we are seeing from China. Like recently, they signed a base deal with what, Solomon Islands. So all these things kind of come into play, right? So in that aspect, the presumption with which Quad was started in 2017 was to talk more overtly and more substantially and objectively on containing China's belligerence in the Indian Ocean region, with a significant aspect of military component involved in it. By military component, I do not mean like a standoff or a war, but in terms of cooperation, in terms of training, etc., etc. But then, for a variety of reasons, uh, for calculations that had happened in New Delhi, significant part of it is because of that, and due to some hesitations that has happened in DC as well as in Canberra, I think all the three nations have come to the conclusion that they will not be able to make a larger bet on China, I mean, against China in the form of Quad. So everyone individually had started hedging against each other. So to kind of like come back to the original point, it means that if there is going to be a more objective and a more direct discussion on China's threat in future, when China raises these stakes in the Indo-Pacific, I think the discussions are going to happen within an AUKUS framework first, and then later in the Quad, rather than it happening in the Quad. Because whenever there is going to be a military dimension that is going to get in, I think the both US and Australia are going to talk more in the AUKUS framework rather than in a Quad framework. Although there might be feelers sent out to both India and Japan as to how do you want, maybe there would be some background discussions going on, but a more confident and more proactive, how do I put it, um, like a more decisive move, I would expect to first come out of the AUKUS rather than from the Quad when it comes to a military response. So that is the zero sum aspect that I see. In that aspect, the Quad might see a reduced relevance in terms of military aspect, but will continue to provide kind of being the support arm for the whole military aspect that Australia and US might do. So we might be providing with alternative sources of logistics, alternative sources of supply chain, alternative sources of humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, building resilient economies and everything. All that thing we will do, but we will never take up the military word as immediately and as proactively as either the US or Australia wants. So that's with regards to the AUKUS. Um, with regards to the overall, I mean, I think I'm just answering a couple of previous points that Rishabh and Akshok made. Uh, I think the US kind of it is important for us to look at the way the US responds or engages us in a more granular manner rather than like a wholesome manner, right? We need not look at them as okay, so US does this XYZ 1 2 3, and therefore its combined picture is this. I think the US is always used to allowing each of its arms, the US state, whether it is the congressional aspect, whether it's the legislative arm or the executive arm, or even within the executive arm, whether it's the State Department or the White House, it allows a certain degree of individuality for each of these arms to make independent degree of engagements and independent assessments. So it is important for us to kind of compartmentalize each of these and view, and then what suits us is probably a comprehensive view, and we should probably be taking a comprehensive view. But it is important to understand that the US has many aspects to it, and each of them can be simultaneously incongruent with each other at the same point of time. That's how the US plays it.
Yeah. Yeah, just to add in a few seconds, I think, of course, we have to see how far will the manifest destiny thing goes for the US, and that's something which we can, I think, I certainly suggest that a whole dialogue on that can happen to understand US foreign policy in that sense. But yeah, of course, there are some shreds of pragmatism involved. So, Akshab, I'm now getting back to you, and this question is the same for Krishnan again, and then I'll ask Rishabh about the Goldilocks principle. So, I have a question for you quickly that I've seen recently that I think Beyond reported that certain US policymakers have come to New Delhi, led by Congressman Adam Smith, who is the chairman of the U.S. House Committee on Armed Services. Uh, if I remember correctly, I think Mr. Smith has been talking about uh, the Indo-US Defense Cooperation on certain aspects where maybe something more could be bolstered. So, how do you see that visit? Do you see that these particular representatives from the US, whether senators or congressmen and women, do you see that their efforts could help to bolster the Indo-US defense ties as far as the current developments from the 2+2 have been? Because there have been some very interesting development from these policymakers that time.
Yeah, it's called CODEL, or short, which is short form for congressional delegations. And my company had the pleasure of organization, the pleasure of hosting them. And a lot of what we discussed is positive, collaboration on the Indo-Pacific. And even though it is the House Armed Services Committee, but it also touched on pertinent issues for the Quad, which is vaccine diplomacy, critical and emerging technologies, supply chain resiliency, then climate action. And fundamentally, yes, at the back of the 2+2, this only further solidifies it, because what's important is not just surface level optics of bilateral ties, but the 2+2. What's really significant about 2+2 dialogues is it really gets into the minutiae and policy works. But of course, when you have congressional delegation visiting, it kind of branches out, because then you have you've got a whole various specialist committees looking into pertinent issues. And I think, as you've seen right now, just as we got the news that just very recently that India has withdrawn, the tender to purchase 48 Russian Mi-17 V5 helicopters. And this is not because just something with the United States, but also pushing India's indigenization. We always touch upon countries' military industrial complex, and indigenization takes place furthermore when a country kind of um, become more economically robust in some ways. And I think it's not just weaning off a Russian era legacy era equipment, but it's also a true pong approach, not just moving into direct United States level of being an import market for US military, but also towards indigenization. And we know one thing firmly from, even while these congressional delegations come and understand that, look, some, and I had a quote, in one of my conversations with congressmen from Texas, said, look, it's not just about India moving away from Russia. It's also about the United States incentivizing India to procure more military equipment from the United States. But um, if you think about India's strategic non-alignment policies, there will always be a sense of splitting think of it as a mutual fund of military procurement, right? If not Russia, Cyprus says around 50% of the equipment. France has gone up. France is India's second highest in terms of military procurement. Then there's Israel, of course, and there's the United States. So India will always have an eclectic mix, because fundamentally India has also realized that too much over reliance on one set of a country's equipment would really help to hurt them as well. In '99 Kargil, what India really points out to its early sense of military detection was Israeli style technology that allowed them to see the northern line infantry in the top heights of Kargil. So look, India will continue, and you've seen right now there's more procurement of Mirage and Rafales. So there will be a sense of multilateral, the multilateral approach that India prefers. There'll be a multilateral approach in defense procurement, and why not? And I think so. Congressional delegation in the back of 2+2 further solidifies the growing India-US strategic partnership, the strong bonhomie that exists. But what it'll also show is that that the umbrage and the ire on India's abstention is fundamentally understood by corridors of where it needs to be understood. Whether individual columnists get it, whether the press corps gets it, that's different. But policy will always be sacrosanctly held by a few, and those who understand it well have sort of reiterated it. So the relationship is just firmly on a strong foot, and it's sort of going to ferment like wine, get better over time.
Great. Krishnan, would you like to add quickly? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I think this congressional delegation is really, really important. The way I see it, I initially, when I heard about this, I thought I would just wave away, because usually these kind of congressional delegations, they have a set pattern and they know what they are really going to discuss about. But this time I think it is really important, because for one reason, I think I remember this back in 2019 or 2020. At that time, there was a kind of a view from one of the journalists who, I mean, Indian journalist who's based in DC. There was a view that we were not reaching out enough to the congressional side of the US government to kind of make our side of, I mean, our perspectives better heard and better understood by the congressional leadership. So, in that sense, the head of the Senate Armed Services Committee kind of coming all the way to India and listening to Indian officials directly, it makes a lot of sense because, see, if you see from an armed services committee perspective, India is definitely not on page 1, 2, 3, or even 4 or 5. It's probably on page 6 or 7. Usually, it is either the Middle East or Europe or Japan or Australia that kind of commands the attention. Usually, what the news that reaches a congressional member is from the staff and the various advisors that these congressmen have around them. So to kind of short circuit that whole, because much of these staff are young, they do not have policy experience, they usually come from a very highly academic background with very little real world policy making experience. It is really, there is a very high possibility that the Indian perspective is lost in all these aspects. So to kind of be able to have the armed services committee, I think not just the chairman, but there was also the ranking member who was also part of the delegation. So in both the sense, I think it's really useful that they were in India because they could hear directly the Indian perspective rather than kind of get filtered through the various staffs. So but then, as Akshob mentioned, the realism hits when India's expectations of Atmanirbharta in Bharat, I mean, in defense, kind of meets the kind of ingrained in blood US trait of trying to sell weapons rather than be able to share technology. So that is a huge friction point that is always going to exist, and that is a gap that is not easily going to be met with each other. But I hope there is better understanding of how India is going to take it, and I think India is going to stand rock solid when it comes to not becoming a just a customer and a client state for US defense products, but India's expectation is firmly going to be grounded in uh, indigenous manufacturing and potentially indigenous development or co-development. So that is a reality I hope the congressional committee takes back, and I think that's the message that needs to kind of reach the top, so that, you know, there is politics within the staff and the various DC beltway politics that goes on. Congressional leaders could be fed with a lot of false truths, a lot of false hopes, and it's important for them to hear what we really want to say. We are two democracies. We should be able to talk openly with each other, and then, like, I think from India side, we are pretty strong in terms of where we are going to stand, and we are not going to budge what the US says. So it's really important that we really talk openly and put forward what we are looking for, rather than trying to sugarcoat it with kind of oh, we'll just buy more weapons from you.
Okay, so really nice to hear. So now I'll go to Rishabh, and this is about the Jaishankar Doctrine. And I think what we will do is that in the concluding remarks, Krishnan and Akshob can give their views on, because this is something which is related to what we have done as India, as we call it Bharatnatyam diplomacy. But I would like to now point out to the Jaishankar Doctrine, as that term became viral a bit on social media, and that's something which is good also. So, uh, the Goldilocks principle, which Minister Jaishankar discusses in 2019 in a meeting at the Atlantic Council. I think Minister Jaishankar had come for the Indo-US visits. I think it was the time of Howdy Modi, if I'm right. I think that was the time when he had stated. I don't remember exactly, but yeah. So what he says exactly, and I will just summarize it for the viewers, is that when he talks about India's relationship with the West, from the colonial angle to the post-colonial angle, and now the proper relationship in a modern world we see, he states that it's a very interesting relationship, that in the Cold War era, the West never wanted India to be too strong and too weak. Dr. Jaishankar says that the West did not care much about the too strong part, they cared much about the too weak part. And the complications were very obvious to see, how we knew, right? The India Soviet relationship and so forth. So now, as this relationship transcends, it is of course a question as to how will it be dealt with, how the Indo-Russian relationship will stand, how the Abraham Accord countries will deal with their relationship with China, Russia, and other countries who might be considered in future and are, in some aspects, considered antagonistic to American interests. And of course, there's a particular sense of understanding around it. So, a very specific and direct question to you, Rishabh, is that as you see this particular doctrine being discussed, as you see the Goldilocks principle as far as this relationship being discussed, and we know that India has been making this position very for a long time under Dr. Jaishankar also, and I think even under late Sushma Swaraj that uh, India in an emerging multipolar world with a multipolar West, as per Dr. Jaishankar's words, uh, India will adopt a multi-alignment approach, which it has adopted. It's very apparent that it has, and the whole churn goes on. So while the churn goes on in the North Atlantic as the stakeholders at various levels, and I'm not talking about the government and the legislators, but the public, the think tanks, of people who are still looking at India differently now. They still have to, because of course, as we know that while at a government level there's a very good relationship going on, there are some stakeholders who have to understand how India looks at its own foreign policy goals. Do you see that what Dr. Jaishankar discusses about, that is the Goldilocks principle, and which very infamously becomes, what, the doctrine itself, and it's also reflective in the book The India Way. Do you see it percolating down in reality as far as the MEA is concerned? India just had a very interesting visit in Netherlands. President Ramnath Kovind had visited Netherlands. That's also something which we can note. So, considering all of this, do you see these aspects, these ideas discussed by our external affairs minister percolating into reality? Because it also resonates with the Prime Minister Modi's vision of Act East and other things. So, we have seen his speeches in the past and so forth. How what do you think?
First, I mean, just like to add something which you guys are talking about before, about AUKUS, etc. I think, again, as people pointed out earlier, anything which is there in the region which tries to counter China, so to speak, is a bonus for India, right? I mean, in some ways, India should not always look at all these things, whether we are a part of it or whether we're being left out, etc. I think it's a good thing because overall, the main, of course, reason for Quad and everything else is basically to balance China, right? To contain China as much as we can to some extent. So in that sense, that's good. And again, as people pointed out before, bilaterally, I think we are doing, or there is progress in terms of the defense relationship. Now, one way I think in which the Goldilocks principle I think becomes more relevant today is something that we were discussing just now, which is basically, this idea of when you say that keeping India in play, but yet also keeping it in check. For example, I mean, the Goldilocks approach, as Mr. Jaishankar articulated it, was about this Goldilocks approach to India in terms of the Indian porridge, as he points out. He says, not too hot, not too cold, needing some effort to kind of get it just right, right? Basically saying that in some instances, especially he points out that during especially the Eisenhower administration, there was a worry about India being weak. It wasn't just about I mean, they also wanted India to be stable enough the subcontinent. It wasn't just the concern with India not getting strong, right? So I think that's the balance that he talks about. And I think he mentions, for example, the importance of the West and the relationship with the West, right? When it comes to all these bigger economies, in fact, he mentions, for example, that all these Asian countries, right? All these Asian countries have looked at the West and have got and gained a lot of from that relationship, especially from the economic perspective. He talks about the Japan overall in the 19th century. He talks about ASEAN in the 1970s, or even South Korea, for example, right? So he says that almost all these impressive growth stories in the last 150 years, right, especially from Asian perspective, have had participation with the West. So in that sense, he mentions that yes, the West has been more receptive in terms of when it comes to developmental goals, etc., helping and aiding a lot of growth stories in Asia. But he does say that, when it comes to industrialization, heavy industrialization, and specifically the defense and security part, the West has been very conservative, right? He says this. He says this very, articulately. He says that, there has been a tendency to kind of manage our relationship to some extent. And so if you look at this Goldilocks thing, I think it is very important in the defense relationship, because here, we would need more commitment, as Akshay pointed out, that it's not just about India taking a step and moving away from, the Russian dependency. It's about also other countries like the USA incentivizing India to do so, right? So it is about how, for example, you aid us, or you help us to move away from that dependency, right? So that is one, right? So when it comes to, for example, sharing or co-developing, as somebody says, sharing more sensitive technology, more advanced system, having those user restrictions a bit diluted, etc. So those things are important, and here I think the Americans will have to make a call, that, whether they just want to arm India enough to, enough for India to just show its teeth to China and other threats in the region, or it, wants to arm India or help India or aid India, and from a defensive perspective, where it can actually bite, right? Because remember, a lot of the reason why we have such an elaborate defense relationship with Russia, is not because of the legacy component part, but also some very advanced technology which don't get from anywhere. So yes, I would say that yes, the US has to do more there. And I think India is willing to do that. And you can see, for example, from the recent number and the graphs that you showed, for example, not this particular graph, but the other graphs that we've talked about before, that there is an increase of India diversifying its defense relationship. Now, coming to the Jaishankar point, and I just quickly just add here, I think what he's basically, I mean, yes, it does translate into reality. If you look at, for example, his book, he talks about that, India has to basically define its interests very clearly. You have to trust your instincts to some extent, right? There has to be some sort of confidence in your nationalist outlook to some extent. And specifically with regards to neighborhood policy, he says that, you have to be generous with some of these countries, especially smaller countries, etc. But you also have to be firm about your red lines, right? So there has to be a mix of generosity and firmness, right? But he does point out by saying that, India is like China, but it's a little bit different from China, in the sense that, we should not, and we do not always harp on a sense of victimhood, so to speak, right? We should not always harken back to this century of humiliation, so to speak. Yes, we should have consciousness of what happened to us, etc. But in that sense, we should not have a grudge, and we should not subscribe to this us versus them kind of philosophy. So he says that, we have to reconcile this nationalism that we see emerging in India, and kind of reconcile it with, this global engagement, and become basically a bridge between established order, so to speak. And last point, which I will just mention, which I think is very crucial and does not get discussed enough, is this idea of leverage that he speaks about. He says that, rather than developing the mindset of not only responding, but to actually leverage competition, is what will define the new India, right? So that is very important, because he says that these cleavages and contradictions that emerge, right, which some people criticize with regard when it comes to Indian policy, he says this is what makes the possibility of leverage viable, right, to begin with. So I think there is a lot of things that we can talk about here. Doctrines cannot be discussed in a few minutes, but I think yes, there is a translation, and when it comes to the Goldilocks principles, etc., I think you can really point out to the defense relationship and what India and United States can do there a bit more. I think there is a lot of potential there, and I think we are on the right track. Thank you.
Great. So, Akshov and Krishnan, just 1 minute concluding remarks. Akshov, we'll start with you, then Krishna. Yeah.
No, absolutely. Look, I think fundamentally this, of course, was a test of India's foreign policy in a lot of ways. When because while forever non-aligned, as we've spoken about India's foreign policy, we've said it's Vasudeva Kutumbakam, global South, all of those adjectives have been added, but what what happened was the Russia changed the Overton window, right? Because let's not forget that in the 21st century, Russia invaded like in 1939, and as a result of which it became a very cantankerous. It became a question of damned if you do, damned if you don't. And of course, I take a lot of umbrage with all these World War II analogies because that's obviously being very intellectually dishonest in some ways. But however, there was still a lot of case to be made for Russia, and it wasn't just Crimea or just Donbass. It was violation of a lot of UN principles. And as a result of which India's foreign policy was tested. It was like, how can India continue this diplomatic war groping? People spoke about India, needing to, eschew from its this policy, and this whole thing of, if you want to be this global leader, what is this diplomatic war groping? But I think, but fundamentally, India has kind of weathered the storm because there is no foreign policy manual for coming out of this. But I think India kind of weathered the storm because if you just look at the last 2 weeks alone, you had Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister, visiting, of course, Chinese minister Wang Yi visiting, UK Foreign Secretary Liz Truss visiting, and 2 weeks later you have a full conference with Secretary of State Tony Blinken. So that is phenomenal because just understanding the gamut, the eclectic mix of different issues discussed and different pernicious thorns in various things. There's the unsettled LAC issue with China. There is the ongoing issue with Russia, Ukraine, plus talks of rupee-ruble trade and talks of military procurement, plus issues with with the United States Secretary of State, partly on Russia, Ukraine, other things on Indo-Pacific and Quad, and larger things. And I think India still being able to do that was phenomenal. I think, however, going forward, what this is going to happen is, by history of evolution, is because the United States now occupies a pantheon in India's foreign trade, and India's commerce, and India's technology, sophistication, military equipment, and of course the diaspora story. Because there is no Russian dream for the Indian diaspora. The Russian language is not something aspired to. There is that, but of course, because the American dream has just been something transformational. I mean, that's been there since the '60s, but there was never. India was never the country that it wanted to be or is now, or perhaps is going to be in the future. So I think that eventually there will be more of a very, very careful with this word. There'll be not alliance, but there'll be more aligned on certain issues going forward. So I think I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Great,
Yeah.
Krishnan. Yeah.
So I'll just summarize the Jaishankar Doctrine as like the Jaishankar Doctrine is all about the laying out a path for India becoming a new pole in the global affairs. So what that means is we are not just going to react based on what US, Russia, China does. We are going to stand by our own conviction, and we are going to stand by our own principles. And it's not like we are just trying to be non-aligned. We are actually trying to set the agenda for how we are going to react in the next 20, 30 years. Now, we don't know what the agenda is going to be for the next 20, 30 years, but the message that I am taking out of all the meetings in the past month is that we are not reacting to these powers making their moves, but we are actually beginning to hold on to our own, and we are trying to make our own way through this entire mess. So that is something that each of these three big countries with which we have engaged are trying to allow us not to do, but that is what we are holding on to. So whether this will succeed or not, I mean, as an Indian, I hope it succeeds, and my hope is that it will succeed. But there is a lot of challenges ahead before we could say that that's a definitive thing to happen.
Great. I think we really had a good discussion, and there will be a lot of developments as various world leaders come to India and India reaches out to the world. With this, we end this episode of Global Hint. I really wish that you would have liked it. Those who Bing watched it, thank you so much. Those who watched it live, again, thank you so much. We'll come up with more episodes for IGP, and till then, no more. Thank you.